Hi friends, my name is Cindy and I am one of the children's librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. And today we're going to work on part 5 of our read aloud, The House with a Clock in Its Walls by John Bellairs and illustrated by Edward Gorey. Are you ready? We were in the middle of a chapter. "Evening, Louis," said Jonathan. "Pull up a chair and dig in." After Louis had eaten 2 or 3 donuts and downed 4 big glasses of cider, Jonathan announced that tonight's entertainment would be historical allusions or famous scenes from the past. He asked Louis what scene he would most like to see. Louis answered immediately, "I want to see the defeat of the Spanish Armada, not the battle scenes because I've read all about them in John L. Stoddard, but he doesn't tell what happened when they had to sail all the way around England and Scotland to get home. I want to see that part." "Very well," said Jonathan. "Let's go over and sit by the fire." They got up and walked over to the fireplace, where 3 big comfortable chairs waited for them. When they were all settled, Jonathan pointed his pipe at the 2 electric candles over the mantelpiece. Slowly the power began to drain from them. They flickered and went out. Then the bulbs in the chandelier over the table began to do the same thing. It was like watching the house lights dim in a theater. Louis felt something tickling his nostrils and his tongue. It was the smell and taste of salt. Grainy, blowing mists filled the room, and Louis found himself standing on a grassy headland. Jonathan was on his left, and Mrs. Zimmerman was on his right. Before them, a cold gray sea tumbled and tossed. "Where are we?" asked Louis. "We are standing on John O'Groats," said Jonathan. "It is the northernmost point in Scotland. The year is 1588, and out there is the Armada, or what is left of it. You'll need the telescope to see them." "Telescope?" said Louis, and then he realized that they were standing on a little stone platform behind a curving waist-high wall. It was the kind of wall you find on scenic lookout points in state parks. And mounted on the wall was a small pay telescope with a set of instructions under glass. Louis bent over and peered at the little card, which said, "See the Armada. Last chance this year. Deposit 5 shillings, if you please." Jonathan fumbled in his vest and dug out 2 large silver coins. He handed them to Louis. They were half-crowns, and each one was worth 2.5 shillings in old-fashioned British money. Louis slid the coins into the slot. There was a whirring sound. He put his eye to the telescope and looked. At first, all he saw was a milky blur, but after he had fiddled with the adjusting wheel a bit, Louis could see several big galleons plowing sluggishly through the waves. Their sails were ripped and torn, and their tattered rigging flew about crazily in the wind. The long rows of gun ports were closed tight against the battering sea, and Louis could see patches on the sides of 3 or 4 ships. One lumbering hulk had a cable passed around its middle, presumably to hold it together. And here's a picture of what Louis was seeing. As Louis watched, the ships wallowed on. Now he could see their tall, ornamented sterns. Saints and bishops and dragons supported gilded window frames or clung to scrolled corners. Louis noticed that several statues had arms or hands or heads missing. One scowling bishop was wearing his mitre at a rakish tilt. Louis turned the telescope. Now he was looking at a strange little man. The man was pacing the quarterdeck of the biggest, richest-looking, but most badly damaged ship of all. He wore a black cape that barely reached to his knees, and he was shivering. His whiskers were long and weepy, and he looked very worried. "Who's the man on the biggest ship?" asked Louis. "That," said Jonathan, "is the Duke of Medina Sidonia. He is the Captain General of the Ocean Sea, which means that he is the commander of the Armada. The whole shot-riddled, sinking mess. I'll bet he wishes he were at home right now." Louis felt sorry for the poor Duke. When he was reading John L. Stoddard in bed the night before, he had wished that he could be there in the narrow seas, commanding a stout English galleon. He would have emptied broadside after broadside into the Duke's flagship until she sank, but now he wanted to help the man if he could. While Louis stood thinking, Jonathan tapped him on the shoulder and pointed to something Louis had not seen before. There, mounted on the wall, stood a cannon. a brass 24-pounder with a wooden step-sided carriage and ropes running from rings in the base of the carriage to rings in the wall. The ropes were to keep the gun from rolling down the hill after it fired. "Come on, Louis," said Jonathan, smiling. "Let's have a shot at the Armada. Isn't this what you've always wanted to do? It's all loaded and ready to fire. Come on." Louis looked as if he were going to be sick. Tears came to his eyes. "Oh, no, Uncle Jonathan, I couldn't. The poor Duke and his men. Can't we do something for them?" Jonathan stared at Louis and rubbed his chin. "You know," he said slowly, "for a boy who loves to play at sieges and war, you are remarkably peaceable. When confronted with the real thing, that is. Fortunately for you, however, this isn't the real thing. It's an illusion, as I may have said before. We're really still in Mrs. Zimmerman's dining room with the table at one end and the purple fire at the other. If you feel that rock over there, it will feel remarkably like an armchair. The Duke and his ships out there are less real than smoke and mist, and so is the cannon. Go on, have a shot." Louis brightened up now. This would be fun. A soldier appeared out of nowhere, dressed in the red costume of an English beefeater. He handed Louis a smoldering wick on a long rod. Louis applied it to the touch hole of the cannon. Boom! The cannon jerked back against its ropes. Bitter smoke drifted past. Jonathan, who was fighting with Mrs. Zimmerman for the use of the pay telescope, said, "I think that—" "Oh, go on, Florence, find your own peephole. Yes, you have brought down his fore-top-gallant spritsail." Louis felt pleased, though he didn't know what a fore-top-gallant spritsail was. The soldier reloaded, and Louis fired again. This time, he knocked a wooden bishop off the heavily ornamented poop deck. He fired several more times. And then Jonathan gestured, and another beefeater came running up the hill, carrying a wooden bucket full of sizzling red-hot cannonballs, or hot potatoes, as the Elizabethan sailors used to call them. The two soldiers loaded the cannon. First, they poured in a keg full of powder. Then they stuffed in wet wadding to keep the cannonball from setting off the powder. Then came the cannonball itself. It hissed and steamed when it touched the wadding. Louis applied the linstock again, and the gun leaped backwards. He watched the cannonball as it whizzed toward the Duke's galleon. It looked to him like a tiny, insane harvest moon. When the ball hit, the ship burst into flames. The weepy, bearded Duke sailed up toward heaven, playing a harp and sitting on a powdered donut. And now Louis, Jonathan, and Mrs. Zimmerman were back in the dining room by the fire. "Well," said Jonathan, rubbing his hands, "and what would you like to see next?" Louis thought a bit. He was so excited and happy he had almost forgotten about what he had to do later that night. "I'd like to see the Battle of Waterloo," he said. Jonathan waved his pipe and the lights went out again. Now they were standing on a muddy hillside in Belgium. The year was 1815. It was raining, a steady, smoking drizzle that half hid the high hill opposite the one they were standing on. In the valley below were little red squares. As they watched, blue arrows crashed into these squares, dented them, turned them into parallelograms, trapezoids, and rhombuses, but did not break them. Little puffs of smoke sprang out on the opposite hillside. They reminded Louis of mushrooms. Behind him he saw geysers of dirt and chipped rock fly up. "Napoleon's artillery," said Jonathan calmly. More mushrooms sprang up on their hillside as Wellington answered with his own cannons. Rockets exploded overhead, green and blue and sizzling white, and of course, lovely purple. Flags rose in the valley, dipped, rose, and fell again. Louis, Jonathan, and Mrs. Zimmerman watched the whole thing from behind a low wall that looked a great deal like the wall on John O'Groats. After what seemed like a long time, Louis became aware of a figure standing off to their right, a tall, skinny man in a cocked hat and a black cutaway coat. Louis recognized him immediately. It was Wellington. He looked exactly the way he did in John Clark Ridpath's History of the World. Wellington scanned the horizon with his telescope. Then he sadly clicked the telescope shut and took out his watch. The watch, which resembled the one Mrs. Zimmerman wore on a chain, dinged 8 times. Wellington rolled his eyes toward the sky, put his hand on his heart, and said gravely, "Oh, that Blucher or night would come." "Why did he say that, Uncle Jonathan?" asked Louis. He had looked at all the illustrations in Ridpath's book, but he had never read the account of the battle. Blucher is a Prussian general who is coming to aid Wellington, said Jonathan. Napoleon has sent Grouchy off to keep Blucher busy. Louis giggled. Why is he called Grouchy? Because that's his name, said Mrs. Zimmerman, only it's pronounced Grouchy because it's a French name. Fat Ears here knows that, but he's trying to be funny. Well, Jonathan, do you think Wellington will win this time? Dunno, Florence. Wait and see. Since it was Jonathan's illusion and not the real battle, and since he was feeling silly that evening, he decided to let Napoleon win for a change. Night fell with a clunk like a book falling out of a bookcase, but Blucher did not come. The blue arrows sliced into the red squares, split them, tore them to pieces. Now the blue arrows turned into an army marching up the hill, an army of tall men wearing bearskin hats that made them even taller. They had long black mustaches and carried muskets with bayonets on the end. They were coming for Wellington, who now looked very red-faced and crabby. He threw his watch on the ground and stomped on it, too. Ooh, wah, he screamed. Greenwich mean time, very mean time. I want to go home now. Whereupon the scene changed, and Louis and Uncle Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman were back in the dark, shadowy dining room by the warm fire. The purple china clock on the mantelpiece wanged tinnily 11 times. The whole show had only taken an hour. Jonathan got up, stretched, yawned, and suggested that they all go to bed. Louis thanked Mrs. Zimmerman for the wonderful party and went home with Jonathan. He went upstairs to bed, but he did not sleep. Chapter 5. As the luminous hands of his new Westclock's bedside clock crept around toward midnight, Louis lay fully dressed under his covers. The room was dark. His heart was pounding, and he kept saying over and over to himself, I wish I didn't have to do it. I wish I didn't have to do it. He felt in his pants pocket for the piece of paper with the magic circle copied on it. There was a fat piece of yellow chalk in his other pocket. What if Uncle Jonathan came to his room to see if he were all right? He'd just have to pull the covers up to his chin and pretend that he was asleep. Tick, 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 tick. Louis wished that it was next week and that he had never made his stupid promise to Tarby. He closed his eyes and stared at the patterns that formed on the insides of his eyelids. Minutes passed. Suddenly, Louis sat up. He threw back the covers and stared at the clock. It was 5 minutes after 12. He had promised to meet Tarby in the cemetery at midnight, and now he was going to be late. What could he do? Tarby wouldn't wait for him. He would go home, and tomorrow he would tell all his friends how Louis had chickened out. Louis rubbed his face and tried to think. The cemetery stood atop a long ridge that rose just on the other side of Wilder Creek Park. You had to walk half a mile beyond the city limits to get to the road that ran up the ridge. There was a shortcut, of course, but Louis hadn't intended to take it. Now he had no choice. Slowly, carefully, Louis eased himself down onto the floor. He knelt down and groped under the bed for his flashlight. It was a long, old-fashioned flashlight with a fluted handle and a big round lamp at the end. The metal felt cold and slimy to his hand. He went to the closet and put on his heavy jacket. It would be cold up on Cemetery Hill. Louis opened the bedroom door. The hall was dark, as usual, and from the next room he could hear Uncle Jonathan snoring. Louis felt awful. It was like being sick to your stomach. He wished with all his heart that he could run into Jonathan's room, wake him up, and tell him all about the adventure he was going on and why he had to go through with it. But he didn't do any of these things. Instead, he tiptoed across the hall and opened the door that led to the back stairs. It didn't take long for Louis to get to the other side of town. When he reached the city limits sign, he poked around by the side of the road until he found a little wooden staircase that ran down the gravel bank to Wilder Creek Park. The creek was fairly shallow at this point, so Louis waded across. The water was freezing on his ankles. When he got to the other side, he looked up. His hands felt sweaty, and he almost turned around and went home. He was looking at Cemetery Hill. It was a high, flat-topped ridge cut across in two places by a narrow dirt road, and it wasn't a hard hill to climb. New Zebedee children went up and down it every day during the summer. But to Louis, who was scared of heights, it might as well have been Mount Everest. Louis looked up at the dark hill, and he swallowed a couple of times. Maybe if he took the long way around. No, he was already late, and Tarby might get bored and go home. The last thing Louis wanted was to be in the cemetery alone at this time of night. He got a tight grip on his flashlight and started to climb. At the first landing, Louis stopped. He was breathing hard, and the front of his jacket was soaked through. There were black smudges on the knees of his trousers, and there was a twig in his shoe. 2 more stages. Louis gritted his teeth and went on. At the top of the hill, he dropped to his knees and crossed himself several times. The sweat was running down his face, and he could feel his heart thumping. Well, he had done it. It was no great triumph, because Tarby had probably scaled the ridge in 1/10 of the time it had taken him. But at least he had done it. Louis looked around. He was standing at the edge of a long avenue lined with willow trees. The bare strings of the willows swayed in the wind, and Louis shivered. He felt very cold and very alone. At the far end of the avenue, the gray gate of the cemetery glimmered. Louis started to walk toward it. The cemetery gate was a heavy arch of stone, covered with elaborate carving. On the lintel were inscribed these words, "The trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised." Louis pushed open the squeaky iron gate and walked quickly past the rows of white headstones. The mausoleum was on the other side of Cemetery Hill, the side that looked out across the deep valley beyond the town. A little narrow path led down to the stone platform in front of the tomb door. Where was Tarby? As Louis looked around, someone said, "Boo!" Louis almost fainted. It was Tarby, of course, hiding in the shadow of the stone arch on the front of the mausoleum. "Hi, you sure took long enough," said Tarby. "Where were you?" "It was hard work climbing," said Louis, staring sadly down at his wet and dirty trousers. "It's always hard climbing for fatzos," said Tarby. "Why don't you lose some weight?" "Come on, let's do what we're supposed to be doing," said Louis. He felt depressed. The cracked and mossy stone slab that lay at the doorstep of the tomb was in the shadow of the hillside now. Everything around it lay in bright moonlight. Louis turned on the flashlight and played the pale beam over the ugly iron doors. A heavy chain held the doors together, and it was fastened by a large heart-shaped padlock. Louis flashed the beam up. There was the strange-looking O on the cornice. The wind had died down. Everything was quiet. Louis handed the flashlight to Tarby and knelt down. Out came the scrap of paper and the chalk. He drew a big circle and then a smaller one within it, like this. As Tarby held the flashlight steady, Louis filled the border of the magic circle with symbols from the piece of paper. When he had chalked in the last strange sign, there was still a blank space in the border. Louis had read in Jonathan's book that you were supposed to fill in the space with the name of the dead person, but he didn't know the name. "Well," said Tarby, "I don't see any dead people." "It's not finished," said Louis. "We've got to put in the name." Tarby looked disgusted. "You mean you don't know it?" "No, I don't," sighed Louis. "Maybe if we sit here for a minute or two it will come to us." They knelt silently at the door of the tomb. A sudden gust of wind rattled the dead leaves on an oak tree that grew nearby. Minutes passed. Louis's mind was completely blank. Then, for some reason, he picked up the chalk. "Hold the flashlight down here," he said. Slowly, carefully, he spelled out a name. The funny thing was that he was not thinking of a name at all. It was as if someone else was guiding his hand. With one last downstroke of the chalk, he completed the word, Selena. It was a strange name. Louis had never known anyone named Selena. He didn't even know how to pronounce the name, but there it was. He stood up with the creased paper in his hand. Now he started to chant in a high-pitched, nervous voice. "Abba, bebe, hacha, babe." He stopped. Tarby, who was crouched beside him, grabbed his arm and squeezed it hard. And that is the end of part 5. In the next part, we'll find out what happens to Lewis and Tarby and raising the dead. My name is Cindy. I am one of the children's librarians in Portland Public Library at Portland, Maine, and I hope that you'll come back for installment number 6 of The House with a Clock in Its Walls by John Bellairs, illustrated by Edward Gorey. Bye, friends.